The stars are bright out here. Yeah, they are. Glad we made it. Couldn't have done it without you, Cord.
The last thing Cord Rourke owned that mattered was a wrench. Not the good kind, not a snap-on with a comfortable grip and a lifetime warranty. A beat-up, chrome-flaking open-end wrench he had pulled out of a dumpster behind a parts shop in Flagstaff 14 months ago, wiped clean on his jeans and kept in his jacket pocket ever since. He had fixed 4 motorcycles with it, 2 trucks, a generator that powered a family's Christmas lights in a parking lot outside Kingman, and 1 very old man's lawnmower in exchange for a hot meal and permission to sleep in the garage for 2 nights running. That was his life. That was the whole of it. I was sitting behind a Sinclair station on the eastern edge of Elko, Nevada, when the sun went down on the 11th night. His back was against the brick wall. The concrete was cold through his jeans. He had eaten half a gas station sandwich 2 hours ago and saved the other half for morning, because that was the kind of calculation he made now, without thinking about it, the way you stop thinking about breathing, the way survival arithmetic becomes its own kind of reflex after enough months of practicing it. He pulled the photograph out of his inside jacket pocket. He had done this so many times in the past 8 months that the edges had gone soft the way paper goes soft when it has been handled by the same hands in the same weather over and over again. The image was still clear enough, a man standing in front of a workbench covered in engine parts, big hands, wide shoulders, a grin that did not look performed, the grin of someone who had just been told something that genuinely pleased them. Frank Rourke, his father, 52 years old in this photograph, the greatest motorcycle builder Cord had ever seen. And Cord had seen plenty in 8 months of moving through the workshops and salvage yards and roadside garages of the American Southwest, learning from men who were generous with their knowledge when you showed up with a willingness to work and did not complain about the hours. He stared at the photograph the way he always did, the way he had since the night 6 years ago when he came home from school and his mother was sitting at the kitchen table with her hands flat on the surface and nothing in the house had been touched, but his father was gone. Not angry gone, not argument gone, just gone. Like a man who had made a decision a long time ago and finally followed through on it the morning Cord was at school learning things that no longer seemed to matter. Cord had been 13. He pulled out the other thing he always carried, a composition notebook, the black and white kind you buy for $1 at a drugstore. Except this one was not bought at a drugstore. His father had given it to him when he was 8 years old, the first day Frank sat him down on an overturned bucket in the garage and started teaching him about engines. Every lesson his father had given him over the next 5 years was in this notebook in Cord's own handwriting, because Frank had told him that writing something down was how you made it yours rather than just his. The cover was held together by electrical tape now. The pages were warped from humidity and one incident with a creek in New Mexico. But every word was still readable, and Cord had read every word so many times he no longer needed to read them. He just opened the notebook sometimes and looked at his own handwriting, recording his father's voice, and remembered what it was like to be 8 years old, and certain that he would grow up to understand everything his father understood. He had come close. He had to give himself that. He closed the notebook. He looked at the sky above the parking lot. He thought about the compound 11 miles east of where he was sitting, which he had found 4 weeks ago, and had been watching from a distance ever since he understood what was parked inside it. The Iron Testament. The motorcycle his father had spent 8 years building. The motorcycle that had not run properly in 3 years. The motorcycle that 73 mechanics, some of the best in the country, had failed to fix and had left shaking their heads. The motorcycle that was supposed to lead a memorial ride for 8 dead men in 6 days and currently could not do it. I thought about what his father had told him the day he was 10 years old, and Frank was teaching him about frames sitting on that same overturned bucket in the garage in Tucson with the afternoon light coming in through the high windows. The engine is the heart, but the frame is the spine. You can have a perfect heart, but if someone broke your spine, you are not walking anywhere. Every mechanic in the world will go straight for the heart when something is wrong. You go for the spine first. Always start with what holds everything else together. Cord stood up. He picked up his wrench. He started walking east. The gate was chain-linked 12 feet high, topped with 3 strands of wire that were not there for decoration. Beyond it, the compound spread across 2 acres of cleared Nevada desert low buildings, A main garage with roll-up doors wide enough for 6 bikes abreast a cluster of trailers that served as offices and storage, and probably as sleeping quarters for whoever drew the short end of any given week, and in the open center of everything lit by a single overhead work light that someone had left burning all night. The Iron Testament. Even from 40 feet away through the chain link, the bike commanded attention in a way that was difficult to articulate to someone who had not spent their life around machines. It was not the largest motorcycle Cord had ever seen. It was not the most aggressively styled or the most visually imposing. What it was finished, completely and utterly finished in the way that machines are finished when one person has spent years making every single decision about them with full intent and full consideration. Nothing on it was there by accident. Nothing on it was there for appearance. Everything was exactly what it was supposed to be and had no interest in being anything else. His father had built it the way his father built everything. Conversation by conversation in steel and chrome, each choice following logically from the one before it, the whole thing adding up to something coherent and specific, the way a well-constructed argument adds up to something you cannot easily refute. There was a man leaning against the fence on the inside, not watching the gate, watching the bike. He was built the way certain men are built, when they have spent decades doing physical work without stopping. Not bulky, just dense, like the muscle had compressed over time into something permanent and load-bearing. 61 years old if the information Cord had gathered from watching and listening was accurate. A beard going silver at the edges, arms crossed over his chest. The expression of a man who had run out of ideas and had not yet run out of time, but could see the point coming toward him where those two things would converge. Rab Calloway, president of the chapter for 19 years. Cord had spent 4 weeks learning everything findable about this compound and the people inside it. He knew the chapter had been planning a memorial ride for 3 years, a ride to honor 8 members who had died in the years since the Iron Testament was brought here. He knew the ride was supposed to leave in 6 days. He knew the families of those 8 men had already started arriving from 3 states because they had been promised this ride was happening, and they had traveled a long way on the strength of that promise. He knew the bike was the only thing standing between a promise kept and a promise broken. And he knew that nobody in the world understood the Iron Testament the way he did because nobody in the world had been taught by the man who built it. Not in workshops, not in trade schools, not in the formal instruction that produced the 73 mechanics who had come and failed. Frank Rourke had taught one person the specific language he used when he built, and that person was standing outside a chain-link fence in Elko, Nevada, with a beat-up wrench in his jacket pocket and 8 months of desert road behind him. He pushed the gate open and walked in. The man who moved to block him was younger, maybe mid-20s, built with the confidence of someone who had been told he was intimidating often enough to internalize it on most occasions. Hey, you lost. Cord kept walking. He had thought about this moment for 8 months through desert heat and winter cold and the creek in New Mexico and the long stretches of highway where the only company was the sound of his own boots on pavement. He had thought carefully about what the first 7 words out of his mouth needed to accomplish. Because in this world with these men, in this compound, the first 7 words were either a door opening or a wall going up, and there was no space between those two outcomes. I know what is wrong with the bike. The young man stopped, not because he was impressed, because something in the delivery of those 7 words short-circuited the standard response. The certainty in them, the flatness, not a plea or a pitch or a gamble, a statement of fact from someone who had no visible reason to lie about it. The stillness spread outward from that moment like rings from a stone dropped in still water. The 2 men near the far wall stopped their conversation mid-sentence. A mechanic who had been bent over a workbench inside the open garage doors straightened up and turned to look. A man sitting on the steps of the nearest trailer stood without quite knowing why he had, and Rab Calloway turned away from the Iron Testament and looked at Cord Rourke for the first time. The silence had a quality to it that Cord recognized from workshops and garages across the Southwest, the quality of a room full of experienced people who have just heard something that does not fit their existing picture and are in the brief moment of deciding whether to update the picture or dismiss what does not fit. Cord reached into his inside jacket pocket. He pulled out the photograph. He held it out toward Rab Calloway. Not submissively, not aggressively, just held it out the way you hold out something you know will be recognized. Rab, 3 steps. Took the photograph, looked at it for 4 seconds, then looked up at Cord. Something moved behind his eyes. Not surprise exactly. Something older than surprise. Kind of recognition that arrives when a thing you had filed under, impossible, turns up anyway. When the world delivers something you had stopped expecting. Frank Rourke, Rab said, his son Cord said. The compound went so quiet that the overhead work light buzzing above the Iron Testament was suddenly audible from 40 feet away. Cord watched the faces nearest to him. He had learned to read rooms the same way he had learned to read engines, by understanding that the surface reveals almost nothing, and the real information is always underneath in the places where people have stopped paying attention to what they show. He saw the young man who had tried to block him take a half step back. He saw the mechanic in the garage doorway look from Cord to the photograph and back with the expression of a man revising a conclusion he had already reached. He saw 2 older men exchange a look that was not skepticism and not belief, but the threshold between them, the look that men exchange when they are deciding how quickly to move towards something new and unexpected. Rab handed the photograph back. He looked at Cord the way you look at a problem you need to solve quickly and with full information. How old are you? 19. Where have you been? Looking for this bike. Rab was quiet for a moment. His jaw moved slightly, the way a man's jaw moves when he is processing information that does not fit neatly into any category he has prepared. Then you have credentials, training, somebody who vouches for you. No, no, and no. Then what exactly are you standing in my compound with, kid? Cord reached into his other jacket pocket and brought out the wrench. The beat-up, chrome-flaking open-end wrench he had carried for 14 months through the American Southwest. He set it on the ground between them without a word. The silence that followed was different from the first silence. The first had been the silence of interruption. This one was the silence of something being understood or beginning to be by men who had spent their working lives learning to read what people chose not to say. Rab looked at the wrench for a long moment. Then he looked at Cord. Then he looked at the Iron Testament, standing in the center of the compound under its single work light, and something passed across his face that was not quite hope, and was close enough to matter. 72 hours, Rab said. Full access to the bike and everything in the shop. If it does not run at the end of 72 hours, we vote on scrapping it, and the memorial ride goes forward without it or does not go forward at all, depending on what the vote decides. You understand what I am telling you? Yes. Bring him to the bike, Rab said. His name was Pitch Weston, 54 years old, working on motorcycles since he was 15, which meant nearly 4 decades of experience in the specific language of engines and frames and the 1,000 ways mechanical things fail and the 1,000 ways people misread why they fail. He had the hands of a man who had spent those 4 decades doing actual work, calloused in the right places, scarred in a few others, the knuckles enlarged the way knuckles get when they have been struck by tools in cold weather over a long career. He had personally spent 40 hours on the Iron Testament before he stopped. Not because he gave up in the ordinary sense, because he had reached the point where the honest thing was to admit the problem was outside his experience. And Pitch Weston had always preferred honesty to the appearance of competence, regardless of what that preference cost him professionally. He had never once regretted that choice, even on the occasions it cost him considerably. He stood next to Cord now, arms crossed, watching with the careful attention of a man who has not yet decided what he is watching. Cord did not go to the engine. He lowered himself to the ground beside the motorcycle. Flat on his back in the Nevada dirt, a small flashlight in one hand, looking up at the underside of the frame. Nobody spoke. The young man, whose name Cord would later learn was Dex, made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite skepticism, but occupied the territory between them. Pitch silenced him with a look that required no words, the look that men of 4 decades experience give to younger men who are witnessing something they do not yet have the context to recognize correctly. Cord lay on the ground for 22 minutes. He moved the flashlight slowly. He was not rushing. He had not rushed anything mechanical since he was 9 years old, and Frank had made him stop and start over 3 times on a single carburetor float until the lesson was permanently installed. Patience was not a personality trait in this work. It was a technical requirement. Speed was what you had left over after you had done everything right. You earned speed by being correct first. You did not borrow against it. He stood up, walked to the tool bench, picked up a magnifying lens, went back to the bike, and lay down again. Pitch moved closer. He stood over Cord for a moment, watching the line of the flashlight beam, watching where Cord kept returning his attention. Then he crouched down beside him. "What are you looking at?" Pitch said. "Weld marks. Under the primary casing. See them." Pitch leaned in. A long moment passed. Then something shifted in his posture, the subtle movement that happens when a man who has been holding a position of comfortable certainty finds the ground under that position less solid than he had assumed. "Those should not be there," Pitch said. No, Cord said. "They should not be there because they were put there after the frame was finished. Someone cut in after the original work was complete, added something, sealed it, and painted over it to match the surrounding surface. If you were not specifically looking for it, you would never find it because you would have no reason to look. The heat pattern on the bead is wrong for the age of the surrounding metal. The oxidation color is wrong. This weld was laid in hotter than my father ever ran his work. My father always ran cool." "How do you know how your father ran his beads?" "He taught me to weld when I was 8 years old," Cord said. "I took notes. I know the difference between his technique and someone else's. He ran it cool because he said a hot bead was a man in a hurry and a hurried weld was a weld you would be back to fix." Pitch stared at the marks for another long moment. Then he stood and looked at Cord with an expression that had replaced skepticism with something less comfortable. Because skepticism is a position you can hold indefinitely, and what replaced it required action. The casing took 3 hours to remove safely. Cord worked with a steadiness that Pitch, after the first 40 minutes, stopped pretending not to watch directly. The kid had not been formally trained. Anyone who knew what formal training produced could see the gaps in his methods. But his hands were certain, and his decisions were deliberate rather than guessed at. And he moved through the work the way people move through territory they have memorized, completely unhurried and without hesitation. When the casing came free, the cavity was immediately visible. 6 inches by 3, recessed into the frame in a location that would have been completely invisible under the casing. Inside the cavity, 3 titanium capsules, each approximately the size of a thumb, each sealed with precision threading, each stamped with a small letter R on the cap. The compound had gathered by this point. There were 40 men standing in a loose ring when Cord reached in and lifted the first capsule out. He unscrewed the cap. Inside, packed carefully, was a substance that looked like very fine metal shavings. An iridescent powder that caught the overhead light in a way that was immediately wrong for anything that had a legitimate reason to be inside a motorcycle frame. Pitch crouched beside him at once, his voice shedding every layer of professional reserve. "That material, if it gets into the oil system when the engine runs, it disrupts the bearing surfaces," Cord said. "At exactly 17 seconds of operation, the engine sounds perfect until then because it is perfect. But when friction reaches operating temperature, the capsules release this compound into the lubrication pathway, and it creates a resonant frequency in the titanium frame components. That is the scream. That is all it ever was. Not a curse," a voice said from somewhere in the ring. "Not any kind of failure that makes mechanical sense," another voice said. And then a third, older and rougher: "Someone built this into the machine. Someone who understood it completely." Rab Calloway stepped through the ring and looked at the powder and the remaining capsules and Cord with the expression of a man who has just been handed a completely different version of a story he thought he knew. "Who knew this machine well enough to do this?" Rab said. Cord did not answer. He was already reaching for the second capsule. Inside the second was a piece of paper thin as onion skin, rolled tight, protected by the titanium against years of Nevada weather. Cord unrolled it with hands that were not quite steady, and he did not pretend they were. He recognized the handwriting before he read a word. He read it once silently. Then Rab said, "Read it out loud." "Not a request." Cord read, "If you are reading this, you found the frame. That means you are either the one I hoped would come, or you are someone smart enough that I do not mind you knowing the truth. The bike works. I want you to understand that first. Every piece of this engine is exactly right. Whatever you heard, whatever made you think something was wrong, that was put there after I finished. Someone got inside this machine. I do not know when. I do not know how much time I have to write this, so I am going to be direct. There is a third capsule. Do not open it with anyone watching. What is inside belongs to my son. If my son never comes, burn it. If he does, Cord, if you are the one reading this, I need you to know that everything I built was for you. Even this, especially this. Nobody moved. The overhead light buzzed. A dog barked once somewhere at the back of the compound and stopped. Cord folded the letter. He put it in his jacket pocket next to the photograph. He stood up. He picked up the third capsule. He looked at Rab. I need a minute. Rab looked at him. Then he said, take your time. One by one, the ring of men stepped by man. Some moved to the far wall. Some returned to the garage. Pitch was the last to go. He paused, looked at Cord, and said quietly, your father was the finest builder I knew in 30 years of this work. He said it as plain fact without anything added to inflate or cushion it. Then he walked away. Cord stood alone with the Iron Testament. The Nevada night was cold, the way the desert gets cold, not gradually but in a fall, like something that has been waiting for permission. He turned the third capsule over in his hands. The small R pressed into the titanium cap. His father had machined this, had filled it, sealed it, hidden it inside a motorcycle frame, with the precision of someone building something designed to survive a specific amount of time and be found by a specific person. I had been 13 when Frank left. He was 19 now, 6 years of moving through other people's spaces, learning other people's trades, carrying a wrench and a notebook and a photograph gone soft at the edges. His father had known he would come. Not when. That he would. He unscrewed the cap. Inside was a folded piece of paper and a small brass key, old-fashioned, the kind that fits a padlock, exactly the right size for a closed fist. He opened the paper and read it. He read it twice, then he stood with it for a long time, and the thing that had lived behind his eyes since he was 13, which he had kept there through desert heat and cold concrete and gas station sandwiches and 11 nights on the ground, moved to the surface and stayed without breaking through, because Cord Rourke had learned in 6 years of being alone that you do not set down what you are carrying until you have somewhere safe to put it. The paper had two things, a list of names and a note that said, the key opens the storage in the secondary building. Third box from the left. Keep what you find there close. Use it carefully. Use it right. He read the list of names. The first name was G. Slade. He folded the paper. He put it in his jacket pocket. He closed his hand around the brass key. He listened to the compound. Distant conversations. The overhead light. Wind in the fence wire. Then from the far corner, footsteps on gravel. One set, moving away, deliberate but unhurried, the steps of someone who had been standing very still for some time and had just decided that remaining was no longer wise. Cord turned his head. A figure at the edge of the work light's reach. Not looking back, already half in shadow, moving toward the gap between the secondary garage and the storage buildings. A man in his 50s. The particular set of shoulders that comes from carrying something heavy for long enough that the weight reshapes you without your noticing. Then the shadow took the figure completely. The gravel went still. Cord stood in the empty circle of light beside the Iron Testament and understood something precise about that departure. Not the absence of a person who had wandered off. The absence of a person who had heard something and needed to be elsewhere before it became something everyone else understood. He turned back to the bike. He put the third capsule in his pocket. He picked up his wrench. He did not tell anyone what was on the list. He did not mention the key. He went back to work. There was a long night ahead, and 72 hours was not generous. And the memorial ride was in 6 days, and the Iron Testament was not running yet. And none of the things he had found in those capsules mattered at all if he could not put this machine together and make it speak the way his father had built it to speak. He had a wrench. He had a notebook. He had hands trained by the man who built this engine, trained from age 8, with the specific, unhurried patience of someone building something meant to last long after both of them were gone. He went back to work. Sully Boone came to stand near him an hour later. 65 years old, thin in the way certain men get thin after decades of a particular life, with careful hands and watchful eyes that had been paying close attention to the world for a very long time. 30 years with this chapter. He had known Frank Rourke longer than almost anyone here. He did not offer to help. He did not ask questions. He stood nearby and watched Cord work with the quality of attention that is both assessment and something older than assessment. The attention of a man who is witnessing something he recognizes from a long distance without being able to fully name it yet. After a while, he said, "Your father used to say a machine is a conversation. Every choice you make when you build something is a sentence. If you know how to read it, you can hear what the builder was thinking across any amount of time and distance." "I know," Cord said. "He told me the same thing." Sully was quiet for a moment. Then he talked about you, the last 2 years before he disappeared. More than he talked about anything else. Cord kept his eyes on the work. He said he had made mistakes he did not know how to fix with words. Sully paused, and the pause had real weight to it. He said he was trying to fix them the only way he knew how. "With machines," Cord said. "With this machine," Sully said. They held that between them without adding to it. The compound quieted around them as the night moved forward. The men, without reason to stay, drifted to their trailers. At some point, without announcement, Pitch Weston came back. He pulled a stool from inside the garage and set it 3 feet from the workbench and sat down. When Cord needed a second set of hands or a specific tool, Pitch was there. When Cord needed nothing, Pitch was quiet. Presence and competence, and the particular silence that functions as its own form of company. The whole offer, nothing more. Around midnight, Cord stopped and put his hand flat on the engine casing. Cold metal. 8 years of his father's best work under his palm. He thought about the list of names in his pocket. He thought about the figure moving away at the edge of the work light. I thought about his father, who had built 3 titanium capsules into a motorcycle frame and designed a sabotage and written 2 letters and hidden a list on all of it pointing at one specific outcome. Not a man who had surrendered, a man who had been building toward one precise moment for a very long time and had trusted everything he built to hold until that moment arrived. Cord picked up a tool. He went back to work. Outside, the Nevada desert was cold, and the stars were the density you only see far from cities. Somewhere near the storage buildings, a man named Garrett Slade sat alone with cold coffee in his hand and did not sleep. The brass key was small and fit perfectly in Cord's closed fist. He had been carrying it for 6 hours before he used it. Through the rest of the first night and the early morning when the compound woke around him and Pitch brought coffee without being asked to. Through the first hour of daylight when Rab came and stood at the garage door and looked at the progress and said nothing because nothing useful could be added. And Rab Calloway had learned over 19 years which moments called for words and which did not. He waited until the compound settled into its mid-morning rhythm. Activity that made one person moving quietly through it effectively invisible. He crossed to the secondary building alone. The storage unit was at the back behind older equipment and 2 motorcycles under canvas tarps that had not been moved in a long time based on the undisturbed dust around them. The padlock was exactly the right size for the key. Everything his father built fit precisely the way it was supposed to fit. That had always been true and was still true even here. The lock opened with the smooth precision of quality hardware maintained properly. Inside shelving boxes, the organized remains of a working life. Tools that were better than average, reference manuals spanning decades, a set of custom fabricated brackets that Cord recognized from the Iron Testament's early design phase, because he had seen sketches of them in the composition notebook when he was 9 years old and had thought they looked like something out of a science fiction illustration. Third box from the left. He pulled it down and opened it. Under clean shop, rags a sealed envelope. The outside said 2 words in his father's handwriting, for Cord. He sat on the floor with his back against the shelving and the envelope in his lap. He acknowledged what he was holding for a moment before opening it. Then he opened it. 2 documents. The first was his own birth certificate with his father's name printed in the appropriate line. His mother had a copy of this. Frank had kept one here sealed and waiting. The second document he did not recognize. Several pages from a hospital. Clinical notes from an emergency admission. He looked at the date. 19 years ago, he read the patient name. Carl Slade. He read the attending physician's notes slowly and completely, reading every line. His father had taught him that the information you skip is always the information that matters most. He read it twice. Then he sat with the document in his hands, and the whole architecture of the past 6 years rearranged itself around him into a shape he had not anticipated. The clinical notes were precise in the way that good medical documentation is precise. Carl Slade had arrived with injuries from a crushing fall, severe injuries that proved fatal within hours. What the attending physician had carefully documented because it was relevant to both the standard of care and the permanent record was that Carl Slade had been drinking. Not casually, the blood alcohol level was recorded with clinical exactness. And there was more. In the section covering the patient's statements upon admission, while Carl Slade was still conscious, the physician had written, patient stated he had consumed alcohol prior to beginning work. Patient stated he had declined a colleague's offer to perform the equipment inspection himself because he did not want the colleague to detect the alcohol. Patient stated he had waved the colleague off and told him the inspection was already complete. The colleague's name was not in the notes. It did not need to be. Cord knew exactly who had been in that garage 19 years ago, who had offered to inspect the equipment, who had been waved off and had signed the inspection checklist at Carl Slade's insistence, because Carl Slade did not want anyone knowing he had been drinking on the job. The hoist had a manufacturer's defect, documented in the investigation that followed. Even a thorough inspection by a sober and experienced man might have missed it because the defect was internal and not visible without complete disassembly of the mechanism. Carl Slade had not died because Frank Rourke was careless or negligent. Carl Slade had died because of a manufacturing flaw in equipment that Carl Slade himself had ensured would not receive a proper inspection on the day it failed. Frank Rourke had carried this document for 19 years. He had carried it through the months when Garrett Slade joined the chapter and began quietly and patiently building the case of blame, one careful conversation at a time. He had carried it through the years when that story hardened inside the chapter into something that felt like established fact. He had carried it through whatever it was that finally made him choose to disappear rather than fight, and he had never used it. Court sat with that fact, not with the document itself, with the choice behind it repeated over and over for 19 years. His father had possessed the means to clear his own name completely for 19 years and had chosen every single time the question must have arisen not to use it. Cord understood the reason. He knew his father's logic the same way he knew the calibration choices in the Iron Testament's engine, not because it had been explained to him, but because he had been taught the philosophy behind it from childhood. You do not reach into a grieving man's loss and remove the part of it that was his dead brother's own mistake. You do not hand someone a document that makes their grief worse by adding shame to it. You absorb the cost. You pay for someone else's peace of mind, and you do it without asking to be acknowledged for doing it. Frank Rourke had understood all of that and had made that choice fully repeatedly for 19 years. The anger arrived without warning, the way real anger does not building, but appearing fully formed in his chest. Not at Garrett Slade, at Frank Rourke. At the man who had had an exit from all of this for 19 years and had never taken it, who had chosen silence and then disappearance, and in those choices had left a 13-year-old boy at a kitchen table with no explanation and a mother who had none to give. He could have come back any time in the 6 years since he left. He had everything he needed. He had chosen not to. He had sent a brass key hidden in titanium and a letter sealed inside a motorcycle frame instead of coming home to the son who was looking for him. Cord sat with the anger and made a practical decision about it. He would carry it the way his father had carried hard things, not forgetting it, not pretending it away, but refusing to let it determine what his hands did next. Later, there would be a place to set it down. Right now, there were 61 hours remaining on a clock that had no interest in anyone's complicated feelings about their absent fathers. He stood up. He put both documents in the envelope. He put the envelope inside his jacket. He walked back to the garage. The next 4 hours were the most concentrated work of the first day. Inside the primary engine systems now and working in there was like reading a document written in a language he had been taught from childhood. Every non-standard choice his father had made, every custom fabrication, every place where Frank Rourke had looked at a factory specification and improved on it, all of it was legible to Cord in a way it could not have been to the 73 mechanics before him. They had been reading a language they had never learned. He had been taught by the author. How was verifying the fuel delivery system when he stopped? He moved the flashlight over the oil reservoir. He leaned closer. He picked up the magnifying lens. He looked for 2 full minutes without speaking. Then he sat back and thought about what he was looking at with the focused calm that was the only useful response to an unexpected finding. Not alarm, not denial, just clear recognition. Fine metal particles nearly invisible to the naked eye suspended in the oil. Not enough to cause immediate failure. Not enough to show up in the first minutes of operation. Enough to destroy the bearing surfaces after approximately 20 minutes of sustained high-speed running. Pitch had checked this reservoir 17 hours ago, clean at 4 in the afternoon. Cord had been in the compound for most of those hours. He had slept for 2 of them. Someone had been in this garage during those 2 hours. Cord worked through the implications completely before acting on any of them. The powder in the titanium capsules had been the first sabotage. 3-year-old patient and architectural design to defeat every mechanic who approached the problem with conventional methods. That required intimate knowledge of the Iron Testament's design. This contamination was different, recent, a response to his arrival and his progress. And it was not designed to stop the bike from running at the compound. If that had been the goal, the method would have been simpler. Cord understood what it was designed to do. It was designed to let him succeed completely, to let him clear every problem, verify every system, hear the engine run, to let the Iron Testament lead 740 men out through the gate with Rab Calloway in the first position, and then 20 minutes into the ride at Devil's Pass, where the route opened to full throttle on a 2-lane road descending through long curves, the engine would seize. At that speed on that road, the result would not be minor. And the man who had rebuilt the engine, who had walked in with 1 wrench and no credentials and been given 72 hours on the strength of a photograph and a name, would be the only person whose work could be questioned. Frank Rourke's son, the unknown 19-year-old who had appeared from nowhere and claimed knowledge no one else had. This was not aimed at the Iron Testament. It was aimed at him specifically, at the name he carried and the possibility that he might succeed. Someone had decided that Cord Rourke succeeding was the most dangerous possible outcome and had moved to prevent it in the most complete way available. Not by stopping the bike, by letting the bike run and then failing with Cord holding every piece of the blame. He drained the reservoir. He flushed the system twice with clean fluid. He replaced the filter and checked every line in the lubrication pathway inch by inch. He worked without stopping and without letting any of it change the quality of his hands. When he finished, he found Rab Calloway behind the main building and told him in 4 sentences. The contamination, the timeline, Devil's Pass in the Memorial Road, the conclusion about what it was designed to accomplish. Rab listened without moving. Then you are certain, I am certain, Cord said. Rab looked at the Iron Testament through the garage door. Someone with access, who understands engines, who waited until you were here and making progress. Yes, Cord said. And you know who? There is a name on the list in the 3rd capsule, Cord said. I will speak with Garrett Slade tonight, Rab said. There is something you should see first, Cord said. He took out the envelope. He handed it over. Rab read both documents completely and without hurrying. When he finished, he held the envelope in both hands and looked at nothing for a while. He carried this, Rab said. 19 years, Cord said, and chose not to use it. He never used it. Rab held the envelope. The silence between them had the texture of 2 people inside the implications of something that had been hidden for a very long time. Your father was a more patient man than I am, Rab said. I was also wrong, Cord said. Plainly, he could have come back. Whatever his reasons, the cost of his choice was not paid by him alone. Rab looked at Cord steadily. No, he said. It was not. He tucked the envelope inside his vest. Fix the bike, he said. Let me handle Garrett Slade. Rab went to find Garrett that evening and was gone over an hour. When he returned alone, his expression said the conversation had shifted the shape of things in a way he had not fully anticipated. Cord did not ask. He watched Rab's face and went back to work. What happened at midnight happened fast. Cord heard them before he saw them. 3 sets of footsteps from the direction of the main gate. He set down his tool and stood. The 3 men who appeared in the garage doorway were not chapter members, not because of anything obvious, but because of the order in which they looked at things when they entered. They looked at the Iron Testament first. They had come with a specific purpose, and the purpose was not him. He stepped between them and the bike. The man in front looked at Cord with the assessing expression of someone who expects to remove an obstacle quickly. Step away from the bike. No. Flat and certain. The same tone as 7 words at a gate the day before. The large man took a step forward. Cord moved sideways to the open engine casing and reached in with both hands and pulled the component free by memory and pressed it against his chest. Without that piece, the Iron Testament was not running in any time frame that mattered. They could destroy everything else. This was the one irreplaceable thing. You want to wreck this machine, Cord said. You are going to have to go through, ma'am, he said it plainly. The large man looked at what Cord was holding. Then Pitch Weston came through the side door. Decks behind him, 2 more chapter members arranged themselves in the space between the 3 visitors and the exit without instruction, as if the geometry made their positions self-evident. The 3 men turned. Rab Calloway walked through the main door with approximately 12 men at his back and stood in the open space and looked at the 3 visitors with the patient, complete attention of a man who has not yet decided what the next 60 seconds will hold but is prepared for any of the available options. The arithmetic of the room had changed completely. The 3 men left, not quickly but without the confidence they arrived with. The garage went quiet. You all right, Rab said. I am all right, Cord said. The component was intact. Rab nodded once. Then someone said, where's Garrett Slade? Nobody had seen him since before the 3 men arrived. His motorcycle was still in the compound, but he was gone from every place anyone checked. Cord understood Garrett had called those men and then left before they arrived. He had set something in motion and removed himself from its immediate consequences. He put the component back in the engine. He picked up his tool. He went back to work. Near 3 in the morning, he went outside for cold air and found Garrett Slade on the outside of the fence, sitting with his back against the chain link and his knees drawn up, looking at nothing. They looked at each other through the fence. Cord took out the clinical notes. He unfolded them and held them at Garrett's eye line through the chain link. Not a weapon. Just here is something that belongs to you now. Garrett reached through and took it. He read in the dark, tilting the pages toward the ambient light. He read slowly and went back over sections. Cord waited. Garrett finished reading. He held the document in both hands and looked at it the way people look at things that have reorganized their world without permission. He had this the whole time, Garrett said. Yes, Cord said. He never showed it to anyone. No. Garrett was quiet. Then Carl asked him not to check. Carl made that call. Yes, Cord said. The hoist had a defect. Even a sober inspection might not have found it. But Carl was the one who decided Frank would not inspect at all. Garrett held the document with hands that were not steady and made no effort to hide it. 11 years, he said, mostly to himself. I know, Cord said. He could have ended this any time he wanted. Garrett paused. He could have destroyed my memory of Carl. He chose not to, Cord said, because telling you the truth would have meant telling you your brother made a mistake the day he died. He thought you needed to keep Carl the way you remembered him. He thought that was worth more than his own name. Cord looked at Garrett through the fence. He was wrong about a lot of things, but he was not wrong about that. Cord waited until the silence had done what silence does when it has enough room. My father chose to protect your brother's memory instead of his own name, Cord said. That cost him everything, including the 6 years I spent looking for him. Do not waste what that cost him. He left the document with Garrett. He walked back inside. He returned to the Iron Testament and went back to work. 31 hours remained. The secondary systems took the time they took. Fuel delivery complete. Ignition integration complete. The electrical pathway his father had routed by hand through the frame in ways that defied the factory schematic and made complete sense against Frank Rourke's specific understanding of how this engine would behave at sustained speed. Complete. Each system verified, each seal confirmed, each connection checked twice. Pitch was on his stool. He had slept a few hours and returned without announcement. Around 4 in the morning in the deep quiet, he said, You found Garrett earlier. Yes, Cord said. Is he coming back in? That is his decision, Cord said. I gave him what my father left for him. Pitch accepted that. Then the 3 men tonight. You knew exactly what mattered when you grabbed that component. I knew the bike needed it. You also knew that everything else in this garage was replaceable, but not that one piece. Yes, Pitch looked at the Iron Testament. Your father had that same quality, he said. In any situation, any amount of noise or confusion, Frank could always find the one thing that actually mattered and protect it first before everything else. Cord kept his eyes on the work. What happened to him? Pitch said. Do you know where he is? No, Cord said. I do not know where he is. Pitch sat with that and did not push further. The calibration bracket was the last thing. His father had marked a custom position with the letter R, not the factory setting. A position calculated for this specific engine's fuel mixture and compression ratio, for the thermal behavior of the titanium frame, for the ignition timing Frank had established across every other part of the system. That was where his father had stopped. Cord ran the calculation he had been building in the background of his mind since he first understood the complete picture of the build. Not the calculation that led to the marked position. The calculation that went 3 steps further, accounting for the variables his father had built into the system, but had not accounted for in the final adjustment, because his father had stopped deliberately, had left this last step for the one person who understood not just what the mark said, but why it existed and what logically came after it. 3 degrees advance from the marked position. Pitch, that is not the marked position. I know, your father stopped at the mark. The marked position is where my father stopped, Cord said. I am finishing where he left off. A long silence. You are certain, Pitch said. Cord had his father's understanding in his hands. 48 hours of reading the machine. His father had built the composition notebook, the photograph, the brass key, the letter that said everything I built was for you. Yes, Cord said. I am certain. He set the calibration. He spent the next hour going over everything one final time, walking around the Iron Testament with the slow attention his father had always given to finished work, looking for the thing he had missed, giving himself one last chance to find it. He found nothing to correct. The Iron Testament was done. He sat with that for a private moment before it became a public fact. Then he looked at Pitch. It is done. Pitch stood and walked to the bike and looked at the finished work from every angle without touching anything. He looked for a long time. Your father could not have done it better himself, he said, without qualification, without anything added, just the plain fact. It still has to run, Cord said. Pitch looked at the Iron Testament. It will run, he said, in the voice of actual belief rather than hope. Outside, the Nevada sky was in the brief hour before sunrise, that color with no adequate name. Cord walked out and stood in the compound and breathed cold air and let himself stop thinking about anything specific for the first time in 3 days. Then he went back inside and lay down on the folded tarp and was asleep before he finished the thought he was having. He slept 4 hours without moving. When he came up, it was 20 minutes to 6. He washed his hands and face at the utility sink. He put on the same jacket he had worn for 3 days. He walked out of the garage. They were there. All of them. Not 40, not any selected group. The full chapter standing across the compound from the garage doors to the outer fence in groups of 2 and 3 and 4 facing inward. Coffee in hands. Conversations at low volume. Nobody had been called. Nobody had organized this. Word had moved through the compound the way it had been moving all week. Not as information, but as something felt before named. The Iron Testament had been rolled out of the garage and positioned in the center of the compound under the open sky. Cord looked at the faces nearest to him. Men he had worked alongside without knowing their names. Men who had handed him tools and brought food. Men who had been skeptical and had reconsidered. Men who had known his father and lost him and spent 6 years without an explanation. Rab Calloway stood near the bike. The families are outside the gate, Rab said. The ones who came for the send-off. I told them 6 o'clock. You told them before you knew if it would run, Cord said. I told them last night, after I talked to you. Rab held his gaze. I know what a man looks like when he knows something will work. Your father had the same look. Cord held that for a moment. Then he walked to the Iron Testament. He stood beside it. He put his hand flat on the fuel tank. Cold metal, precise surfaces, 8 years of one man's best work under his palm. He held his hand there for a moment. Then he took it away. He swung his leg over and settled into the seat. The bike had been built for a taller man. He felt that immediately. His father's dimensions, not his. He had spent his whole life measuring himself against those dimensions and had stopped trying to fill them somewhere in the Nevada desert 8 months ago. You did not have to be your father's size to finish your father's work. He put both hands on the grips. The compound went absolutely silent, not the silence of people choosing quiet, the silence of 740 people whose attention had synchronized into the same held moment. A physical thing felt before understood. Cord pressed the starter. The engine turned over. The exhaust fired once a deep percussion that moved through the concrete and through the frame, and through Cord's hands and through the chest of every person in that compound. Then the engine caught. The Iron Testament came alive. Deep, even, completely without hesitation. The sound of a machine doing exactly what it had been built to do for the first time without 3 years of interference between it and its own nature. Not loud for the sake of volume. Authoritative the way. Real things are authoritative not by demanding attention, but by earning it completely. 5 seconds. 10, 14, 17. Nobody breathed. The whole compound counted without counting the number written into the muscle memory of everyone who had stood here over 3 years and heard the scream in the silence at that exact moment. The number had become a definition of what this machine could not do. 18 seconds. The engine did not scream. It ran. Clean and even and strong, the exhaust note, steady as a heartbeat, the whole machine alive under Cord's hands. 20 seconds. 30. The Iron Testament ran the way his father had built it, to run with the full authority of something that has been waiting a long time to be itself. The sound from 740 men at that moment was not a cheer. It was older than that. The sound that comes from people when something they had stopped believing in becomes true in front of them. Involuntary. A release of 3 years of held pressure. Cord let the engine run for a full minute. He sat in the seat calibrated for a different body and felt the full weight of all 3 days and all 8 months in all 6 years arrive in him simultaneously. And he looked at the concrete beneath the tires because his face was doing something he did not want witnessed. He cut the ignition. The silence that followed was different from every silence before it. Settled. The silence of a question that has been answered and does not need to be asked again. He got off the bike. Rab Calloway put a hand on his shoulder, heavy and deliberate. Your father would be, Rab started. Please, Cord said. Not harshly. Don't. Rab stopped. He understood. He stood next to Cord instead, both of them facing the Iron Testament, and that was enough. Exactly enough, and nothing more than that. The applause started from one pair of hands, slow and deliberate, then 2, then 10, then it built through the compound until it was no longer applause in any ordinary sense, but something that moved through the air the way the engine had felt before understood. Cord kept his eyes down. He had earned this much. It was Dex who came to him 20 minutes later. There is a truck at the gate, Dex said. Flatbed. Driver was paid in cash and given this address. The manifest says it is from F. Rourke. It says for my son when he finishes. Cord was still for a moment. Then he walked to the gate. The crate on the flatbed was wooden and well-built, secured with a padlock. Cord reached into his pocket and took out the brass key. It fit. He opened the crate. Inside, packed in foam and cloth, a motorcycle jacket. Old leather shaped by years of actual use. The elbows worn in a specific way. The collar broken to one side. The whole thing carrying the compressed history of the life lived inside it. On the back, hand-stitched in faded but unfrayed thread, one word. Rourke, under the jacket in the foam, a sealed envelope. Inside, a single index card. His father's handwriting. Cord read it once to himself. Then Rab, who had come to the gate, said, "Read it out loud." Cord read, "If you are reading this, you did what I knew you could do. I am sorry I was not there to see it. I am sorry for more than I can fix with wrenches, and I know that is not enough, and I am saying it anyway. The jacket was your grandfather's, then mine. It was always going to be yours. I need you to know that I never stopped watching. I never stopped knowing who you were becoming. You were the best thing I ever had a hand in, and I am proud of what you made of yourself, prouder than I have words for. I love you, Cord. That was always the part I should have said out loud every day for every year I had with you. I did not say it enough. I am saying it now. Wear the jacket when you are ready. Your father, Frank. The truck driver looked at his boots. Dex looked at the sky. Pitch turned to the fence line with one hand briefly at his face. Sully Boone looked directly at Cord with eyes that were not dry and did not pretend to be, and nodded once the slow nod of a man acknowledging something true and costly and necessary. Cord stood at the gate holding the index card. The anger he had been carrying since the storage unit was still present. He expected it would be there for a long time. A letter did not dissolve 6 years. A jacket did not dissolve the choice to stay away. A man did not earn his son's full forgiveness by leaving a key in a capsule and a crate on a flatbed truck. That was not how these things worked, and he did not pretend otherwise. But something else was present alongside the anger. Now, the Iron Testament had run. The calibration his father had left unfinished was finished. The conversation his father had been writing in steel for 8 years had reached its last sentence and Cord had written it. His father had trusted him with that last sentence, had built the entire machine around the assumption that Cord would arrive and understand and be capable of completing what Frank had started. His father had been wrong about many things. In the only language that had ever fully worked between them, he had also said everything that needed to be said. Cord folded the index card. He put it in his pocket next to the photograph and the letter from the capsule. He looked at the leather jacket in the crate. He reached in and picked it up. Heavy, the weight of old leather and two men's lives before his hands. He put it on, too big across the shoulders. His father's dimensions, not his. He wore it anyway because it was his and had always been his. The name on the back was the point. He was standing at the gate in his grandfather's jacket with his father's name across his back when he heard footsteps. He turned. Garrett Slade was at the outer edge of the gate. He had come on foot, no motorcycle, no colors, no declaration of any position. A man in his 50s at the boundary of a place he had belonged to for 11 years, standing on the outside of it, uncertain whether he was still permitted to cross. He looked at Cord. He looked at the jacket. He looked at the name on the back. I heard it run, Garrett said. His voice had the roughness of a man who has been alone in the cold with something heavy. I was outside the fence. I heard it start, and I stayed to listen. Cord looked at him and said nothing. Your father, Garrett said. He had that document the whole time. He could have used it any time he wanted. He could have ended it. He paused. He could have destroyed my memory of Carl. He chose not to. No, Cord said. He chose not to. Garrett looked at the Iron Testament visible beyond Cord through the open gate. I do not know, Garrett said slowly, what sorry looks like for something this size. Cord held the man's eyes. He thought about 11 years of grief aimed in the wrong direction and then having the foundation of it removed in one cold hour by a fence in the dark. He thought about his father carrying a document for 19 years and to protect the man working to destroy him. He thought about the cost of that choice and who paid it and what it meant that Frank had gone on paying it year after year in silence. I think it looks like standing where you are standing, Cord said. I think it looks like coming back when you did not have to. Garrett absorbed that. Something in his face shifted, not resolution, not absolution, but a beginning. The kind that takes a long time to become what it needs to become. Rab Calloway stepped forward and stood beside Cord for a moment. Then he looked at Garrett and said, walk with me. 2 words with 19 years behind them. Garrett nodded. He crossed the gate. They walked toward the far end of the compound, and whatever was said in that conversation belonged to them and to nobody else. Cord watched them go and understood that some debts take longer to settle than others, and some are never fully settled but can begin, and beginning was what was happening. His father would have recognized it. His father had been patient with beginnings above everything else. It was how he had built his whole life. The vote was brief. Rab conducted it, standing before the gathered chapter with the morning sky behind him and the Iron Testament beside him. The chapter voted, and every hand went up, including the men who had been skeptical, and the men who had watched from a distance, and the men who had taken the longest to decide what they were looking at. Rab held out the patch. Cord took it. He held it in both hands and let it mean what it meant without trying to make it larger or smaller than that. Your father came through that gate at 23, Rab said. No credentials, no one who knew him. and he had a box of tools he had carried on a 4-day bus ride from Tucson. He asked to look at a bike we had given up on. I gave him 48 hours. He fixed it in 31. Rab paused. You had one wrench. You had 72 hours. You finished in 68. Cord stood with the patch and felt the distance between 23 and 19, between 31 hours and 68, between a father and a son doing the same thing at the same gate a generation apart. He put the patch in his jacket pocket. He was not quite ready yet. He would know when he was ready. His father had taught him that the work is done when it is right, not when you are in a hurry, not when someone is watching. When it is right, he was close. The memorial ride left the compound at 8 o'clock in the morning. The Iron Testament rolled out through the gate at the head of 740 motorcycles with Rab Calloway in the seat, which was right. Cord rode directly behind it in the second position on a borrowed machine that handled cleanly and asked nothing of him he could not give. He was wearing his grandfather's jacket, his father's name across the back. 740 motorcycles on an open Nevada highway in the morning is a sound and a feeling that exists in its own category. Not music and not noise, but something more fundamental. Something the human body responds to before the mind has processed it. Cord rode inside that sound and let it be around him completely. He did not think about the 3 days or the capsules or the fence in the dark or the clinical notes that had traveled 19 years to reach the hands they belonged to. He rode through the Nevada desert in the morning light in his grandfather's leather, with his father's name on his back, and he was present in the complete way that you can only be present when you have been moving toward something for a long time and have finally arrived at it. There were memorial stops where names were spoken and silences held, and the dignity this chapter brought to remembering its dead was fully present. Cord stood at each stop among men whose names he was still learning and felt what it meant to be part of something that took its losses seriously and remembered them with full attention. At different stops along the road, at different distances through the crowd, he caught sight of Garrett's Slade, not at the center of things, at the edges present without being prominent, beginning the long process of being somewhere after years of being aimed in the wrong direction. He had a long way to go. Cord knew that without pretending otherwise. But Garrett had come back through the gate and had ridden the memorial route alongside the men he had wronged, and beginning was what was available, and beginning was what he was doing with it. At Devil's Pass, the road did what it always did, narrowed to 2 lanes and descended through long, carved curves, demanding full attention and rewarding full commitment, separating the people who were truly present from the people going through motions. Rab Calloway opened the Iron Testament to full throttle. The sound that came back from the canyon walls was not a scream. It was a roar, deep and clean and completely without hesitation. The voice of a machine that had been built to do exactly this on exactly this road and was doing it for the first time without 3 years of interference between it and its own nature. The sound filled the canyon and returned from both walls and passed through 740 riders like something that had been waiting to be said at full volume for a long time. Cord heard it from the second position and felt it move through him and understood what his father had been building toward. Not just a motorcycle, not just a machine to lead a memorial run, a voice, something that would speak after he could not, something built in the language that had always worked between Frank Rourke and his son in steel and precision, and the specific weight of a thing made with full intent and left for the right hands to complete. The ride ended at sundown at a campground in the high desert east of the route where fires had been built, and the air carried pine and wood smoke and the cold clarity of desert altitude. The chapter came in from the highway and settled around the fires, and the evening became what evenings become when something difficult has been accomplished by people who were not certain they could accomplish it. Cord sat down with his back against the rear wheel of the Iron Testament, which Rab had parked at the edge of the gathering. He stretched his legs out. He looked at the nearest fire and felt its heat on his face and the cold of the desert evening at his back through the old leather, and he held both together, the heat and the cold, the way you hold things that are finally allowed to be exactly what they are. After a while, Rab sat down beside him, both of them facing the fire. "What happens now?" Cord said. "Whatever you want to happen," Rab said. Cord thought about that with the deliberate attention he brought to mechanical problems. He thought about the notebook in his jacket and the photograph in the index card. He thought about the patch in his pocket. I thought about his father somewhere in the world tonight. who had sent a truck and a jacket and A-card time to arrive at exactly the right moment, who had built a machine with a final calibration designed for smaller hands and left it where his son could find it when his son was ready. Do you think he knew, Cord said, that I would actually make it here? Rab looked at the fire. He built the last calibration for hands smaller than his own, he said. He timed a delivery for the morning he expected you to finish. He designed the final step specifically for someone who had been taught by him and no one else. He paused. What do you think? Cord looked at the fire. I think he always knew I was coming, he said. He just could not know when. And you came, Rab said. I came, Cord said. He reached into his jacket pocket. He took out the patch. He held it in both hands in the firelight. The anger was still there. He expected it would be there for a long time. A father did not earn his son's full forgiveness in a single week by leaving a key in a capsule and a jacket in a crate. That was not how these things worked. But the anger and the belonging were not opposites. A man could carry both. His father had carried harder combinations than that for 19 years without losing what mattered. He put the patch on. It belonged there. He had known it would belong there since Rab first held it out, but he had needed the day and the ride in the fire and the weight of the evening settling around him before he was ready to make it permanent. Now he was ready. He could feel it the same way he felt when a calibration was right, not because anyone told him, not because he was in a hurry, but because the whole system confirmed it. Sully Boone appeared at the edge of the firelight and sat down a few feet away without asking whether he was welcome, which was the right call. 30 years with this chapter, and he had watched a 19-year-old walk through the gate with one wrench and finish what Frank Rourke had left unfinished, and he deserved to sit by this fire without needing to justify it. The fire burned. The desert night was cold, and the stars overhead were the density you only see far from cities. Somewhere in the gathering, a story was being told about one of the 8 men this ride had honored, and the people around the teller were listening with the quality of attention that only comes when the dead were people you actually loved. Cord listened too. He did not know the man being remembered. He would learn him the same way he would learn the names of the people around these fires in the history of this chapter and the full weight of what the patch on his jacket meant. He had time now. He was 19 years old and he had arrived at the place he had been moving toward, and there was time for things that had seemed impossible before. He put his hand in his jacket pocket. His fingers found the photograph soft at the edges and the index card with his father's handwriting. Everything I built was for you, even this, especially this. He let his hand rest there for a moment. The fire in front of him, the cold at his back, the desert around him in every direction, and the weight of the patch on his jacket. And somewhere in the world, his father, who had made choices that were wrong and choices that were right, and had left behind a machine that spoke for him in the only language that had always worked between them. Cord sat by the fire and let the evening be what it was. I was 19 years old. He had a wrench in his pocket and a notebook against his ribs and a photograph gone soft at the edges and a patch on his jacket that meant he was somewhere now connected to something real, not just moving through. He had one wrench and 2 hands and everything his father had ever taught him. It turned out that was exactly enough.